Good day, everyone. Today we begin our review of chapters 1. Students think analysis is very meant for graduation. Reality is much more than that. Should be demonstrate that you can identify real-world problems, examine it systematically, analyze evidence, and contribute to meaningful knowledge to your discipline. In other words, the thesis represents your transition from being merely a consumer of knowledge into becoming a producer of knowledge. Throughout this review, we will not simply discuss research concepts in theory. Instead, focus on how to actually write each section of thesis in chapters 1 to 3. Every chapter has its own purpose. Every paragraph has its own function, and every sentence should move your argument forward. By the end of this course, you should not only understand what belongs in each chapter, but also know why it belongs there. Many students become overwhelmed because they look at the thesis as one enormous document. Thesis is not written all at once. It's written one section at a time. A little bit background. Formulate your research questions, review the literature, design your methodology, analyze your findings, and finally draw conclusions. When viewed this way, the thesis becomes a series of manageable tasks instead of an impossible project. Allow me to share my slide now. There. Let me close my video to minimize. Oh. So, our goal is review is guide you through their journey or beginning to end and explain the purpose of every major section. By understanding the logic behind the structure, writing becomes much easier because you know exactly what each chapter is expected to accomplish. Overall structure of the master's thesis. The master's thesis follows a standard structure. Its research is expected to communicate ideas clearly, consistently. Although each topic is different, we'll see that in our synchronous lecture later. The organization of scholarly writing remains largely the same. This standard format allows readers, advisors, panel members, and future researchers to easily locate the information they need. Notice that the thesis is divided into three major parts. The first is the preliminaries. These are the figures that use your work formally, but did not contain the research itself. Establish the identity, utilization of the document. Think of them as the front entrance to your thesis. The second part consists of the 5 main chapters. These chapters tell the complete story of your research. Chapter 1 explains the problem and why it matters. Chapter 2 shows what previous scholars have already discovered. Chapter 3 explains how your study sets and analyzes your findings. Finally, chapter 5 summarizes the study, presents conclusions, and offer recommendations. The final part consists of the back sheets, and many students underestimate their importance. But they are essential because they provide transparency and accountability. Your references demonstrate that your ideas are grounded in credible scholarship. References in supporting documents, such as research instruments and letters, introduces you as a researcher. And together, these three parts form a complete scholarly document. Preliminaries overview. Before the reader reaches chapter 1, several important pages prepared the document. Collectively, these are called the preliminaries. Although they contain little discussion on research itself, they establish professionalism and demonstrate that the thesis follows fictional records, which is a title page. This identifies your research by presenting the title, your name, your institution, your degree program, and the submission date. A good title immediately communicates what the study is about. It should be concise, informative, and accurately reflect the major concepts being investigated. Following the title page are the disclaimer, endorsement, and approval pages. These pages are certified that this is found to be appropriate debit process. The disclaimer identifies the document as an official academic work, while the endorsement and approval pages bear the signatures of advisors and panel members, indicating that the work has met institutional standards. Finally, the preliminaries include the acknowledgement, abstract, table of contents, and the various lists such as tables, figures, appendices, and acronyms. These sections improve the readability of the thesis. The abstract summarizes the entire study in just a few paragraphs, while the table of contents and lists help readers quickly take information throughout the manuscript. Let's look at the chapter overview. The heart of every thesis lies in its 5 chapters, as we've said. Each chapter answers a different question about the research. Together, they create a logical flow from identifying a problem to proposing solutions based on evidence. One answers the question, the solve. Introduces the research problem, explains its context, its objectives, identifies the significance of the study, defines its scope, and clarifies important terms. This chapter convinces readers that the study deserves to be conducted. Chapter 2 asks, what do we already know? Here you examine previous literature and related studies. Instead of merely summarizing sources, you compare them, agreements and disagreements, and discover the research gap. This gap becomes the justification for concluding your study. The chapter concludes by presenting the conceptual or theoretical framework that guides the research. Chapter 3 explains how was the study conducted. It discusses the research design, participants or units of analysis, sampling, instruments, data collection procedures, and methods of data analysis. Readers should be able to understand exactly how the research was performed, why these methods were finally. Chapters 4 answers what we discovered. Chapter 5 answers what we discoveries mean. Together, these chapters transform collected data into meaningful conclusions and practical recommendations that can contribute to policy, practice, or future research. We also spoke of backsheets a while ago. After the first 5 chapters, or after the 5 chapters are completed, the thesis concludes with what we call the backsheets. Okay, here are essential, especially relation to story writing, because they demonstrate transparency, accountability, and academic integrity. The first part is the reference section, where every idea, quotation, statistic, or theory borrowed from another author must be properly cited and listed here using the required APA referencing style. Accurate referencing does more than avoid plagiarism. It allows readers to verify your sources and continue exploring the literature themselves. A strong thesis is built on credible, properly documented scholarship. The second component is appendices. The use of the supporting materials that interact of the main text if placed inside the chapters. Examples include interview guides, survey questionnaires, informed consent forms, letters requesting permission, validation reports, photographs, and other supplementary documents. Including these materials demonstrates that your study was conducted systematically and ethically. The final component is the biographical sketch. While this may seem like a simple profile, it formally introduces you as the researcher. It briefly describes your educational background, professional experience, and other relevant qualifications. Together, the references and appendices, the backsheets, the thesis, by documenting the evidence behind the study and personal responsible for conducting it. Let's begin then with the preliminaries. The first page of your thesis is called the title page. And although it appears simple, it is actually one of the most important pages in the entire manuscript. It creates the first impression of your research. Before your panel members read your introduction or methodology, you first see your title. For the reason, your title should indicate your studies of. Triggers, and concepts involved, and often the population or setting being studied. One of the biggest mistakes graduate students make is creating titles that are unnecessarily long. We are reminded that the title should ideally be no more than 3 lines or about 20 words. This limitation forces us to identify the essence of our study. Means that the research problem is still. Remember that clarity is more important than complexity. A concise title is usually a stronger title. Notice also the advice to avoid expressions such as an analysis of, an assessment of. These phrases do not really tell us anything about the study. Every thesis is by nature an analysis or an assessment. Instead of describing what you are doing, describe what you are studying. For example, instead of writing an analysis of employee motivation, write employee motivation and organizational commitment among public health workers. The second title immediately tells the reader what concepts are being investigated. Pay attention to like values decision, not only in ideas, but also in presentation. The title page should appear balanced and symmetrical. Even details such as where a line ends matter. The first line should not end with a conjunction, article, or preposition because these interrupt the visual flow of the page. These may seem like minor details, but collectively, they communicate professionalism and careful scholarship. Disclaimer page. The next page after the title is in the preliminaries is the disclaimer page. This page is often students assume it is only a legal formality. It's still important for purposes. Identifies the thesis as an official academic document submitted to the institution. In this case, it states that the thesis is an official document of the Development Academy of the Philippines Graduate School of Public and Development Management. The disclaimer also protects the intellectual property contained in the thesis. It reminds readers that reproduction work this is important because research represents original intellectual effort. And knowledge is meant to be shared, it must also be respected. Academic institutions, therefore, establish clear guidelines on how research may be used by others. Perhaps even more important is the statement that the opinions, interpretations, conclusions, and recommendations contained in the thesis belong to the author. This means that although the university approves the research as an academic work, it does not necessarily endorse every argument made by the researcher. The institution certifies that proper scholarly procedures responsibility for ideas remain with the author alone. This distinction reflects an important principle in graduate education. Universities encourage independent thinking. They do not expect every researcher to reach identical conclusions. Instead, they expect conclusions to be supported by evidence, sound reasoning, and ethical research practices. The disclaimer, therefore, protects both the institution and the academic freedom of the researcher. Still part of the preliminaries are the endorsement page and the approval page. They represent two different stages in the evaluation of the thesis. Based on the preliminaries, they serve different functions. Understanding the distinction helps students appreciate the entire thesis evaluation process. The endorsement page is signed by your thesis advisor before your final defense. By signing this page, the advisor certifies that the manuscript has reached a level of quality appropriate for presentation before the examining panel. This does not necessarily mean the thesis is perfect. Rather, it means the advisor believes that the study is sufficiently developed to undergo formal evaluation. After the defense comes the optional page. This page contains the signatures of members of the examining panel, as well as the dean authorized academic official. Signatures indicate that the thesis has successfully met the academic standards required by the graduate school. In many cases, approval comes after the student has completed the revisions required by the panel. These pages reminds us that the research is never produced in isolation. A master's thesis is the result of collaboration among the student, advisor, panel members, and the institutions. While the researcher is responsible for the work, the academic community ensures that the research meets accepted scholarly standards before it becomes part of the institution's body of knowledge. Next is the acknowledgement page. This provides the researcher with the opportunity to express gratitude to the individuals and organizations that contributed to the successful completion of the study. Sorry, somebody texted. Unlike the technical chapters of the thesis, this section is very personal. Nevertheless, it remains an important part of scholarly writing because research is rarely accomplished alone. Many people contribute to the completion of a thesis. Advisors provide academic guidance. Panel members offer constructive criticism that strengthens the study. Respondents freely share their experiences or data. Institutions provide permission, physical support, or access to documents. Family members often provide emotional encouragement. The acknowledgement recognizes these contributions. However, the acknowledgement should also remain professional. This is not the place for lengthy personal stories or highly emotional reflections. Instead, the researcher should clearly identify the individuals or institutions being thanked and briefly explain the nature of their contribution. Sincerity is more valuable than excessive praise. Ultimately, the acknowledgement reminds us that research is an individual and a collective endeavor. When one person's name appears on the title page, the completed thesis often reflects the support, mentorship, cooperation, and encouragement of many others. Expressing gratitude is therefore both an academic courtesy and a recognition of the collaborative nature of scholarship. Next is the abstract. The abstract is one of the most frequently read sections of any thesis. In many cases, it's the only part that busy readers, policymakers, or even future researchers will read before deciding whether to continue the full manuscript. Because of these, the abstracts complete and concise summary of higher study. The presentation recommends organizing the abstract in 4 logical paragraphs. The first paragraph recommends organizing the abstract, the objectives and scope of the study. It explains what problem the researcher investigated and why the study was conducted. The second paragraph briefly describes the methodology, including the research design, participants, data collection procedures, and methods of analysis. Readers should immediately understand how the study was carried out. The third paragraph summarizes the major findings of the research. This is not the place to present detailed statistics or lengthy quotations. Instead, highlight only the most important discoveries that directly answer the research questions. Finally, the fourth paragraph presents the principal conclusions that can reasonably be drawn from those findings. These conclusions should logically follow from the evidence presented. So, an important component of or an important characteristic of a good abstract is that it can stand on its own. A reader should be able to understand the purpose, methods, findings, and conclusions of the study without referring to the rest of the thesis. For that reason, every sentence should contribute essential information. Avoid unnecessary details, lengthy explanations, or even citations. Think of the abstract as a miniature version of your entire thesis. Brief, complete, and self-contained. There are some key rules in writing the abstract. Since we've already looked at the structure, let's now discuss the rules for writing one correctly. An abstract is not simply a shortened introduction. It is a carefully written summary of the entire completed study. Because it may be the first and sometimes the only part that people read, every sentence must be clear, concise, and informative. The first rule is to avoid abbreviations unless they are first explained. Suppose your study involves the Philippine Coast Guard, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, or a civil military operation. Instead of immediately writing PCG, AFP, or CMO, you should first write the complete term followed by the abbreviation in parentheses. For example, write civil military operation, close and open parentheses, CMO, before using CMO in latter sentences. Remember that your readers may come from different disciplines and may not be familiar with the observations you use every day. The second rule is not to use section headings inside the abstract. You should not label paragraphs as objectives, methods, results, or even conclusions. Instead, the abstract should read like one continuous narrative. The transition from one idea to another should happen naturally through the writing itself rather than through headings. This gives the abstract a smoother flow and allows it to function as a single self-contained summary. Finally, the presentation reminds us to use the past tense. Since the abstract summarizes a completed study, the research has already been conducted. Therefore, we write statements such as the study examined, data were collected, or the findings showed. Consistency in tense demonstrates that the research process has already been completed. The slide also recommends following American English conventions throughout the manuscript, ensuring consistency in spelling and, more importantly, in style. Table of contents and your lists. After the abstract comes the table of contents. And lists. Very important role in helping readers navigate your thesis efficiently. Imagine reading a 300-page document without knowing where any section begins. The table of contents solved that problem by providing a roadmap of the entire manuscript. One important feature discussed is the pagination rule. The preliminary pages use lowercase Roman numerals, such as you can see in this slide, 1, 2, and 3. These page numbers are usually centered near the bottom of the page. And once chapter 1 begins, the numbering changes to Arabic numerals, starting with 1. Another important formatting rule is that the opening page of each chapter is counted, but sometimes does not display a page number. These conventions help distinguish the front matter from the main body of the text. Besides the table of contents, several lists are required. The list of tables identifies every table used in the study along with the page number. The list of figures performs the same function for graphs, diagrams, maps, photographs, and illustrations. And if your thesis contains appendices, a list of appendices should also be included. Finally, if your study contains numerous abbreviations, a list of acronyms arranged alphabetically allows readers to locate their meanings quickly. These pages demonstrates another important principle of graduate writing. Organization matters. Good research is not only about discovering new knowledge, it is also about presenting what knowledge in a way, or we also need to present that knowledge in a way that others can easily understand and use. A well-organized thesis respects the reader's time and reflects the discipline of the researcher. Allow me to go now to the first chapter. Let's begin with chapter 1, the problem and its context. We now arrive at the first major chapter of the thesis. Everything before this point introduces the document itself. Beginning with chapter 1, we begin discussing the actual research. This chapter answers perhaps the most fundamental question in scholarship. Why does this study need to exist? Notice that chapter 1 is divided into 6 sections. It begins with the background of the study, where you introduce the issue and explain why it deserves investigation. Next comes the problem statement, where the broad issue is transformed into specific research questions. After that, you present the goals and objectives, followed by the significance of the study, which explains who will benefit from your research and why those benefits matter. The final 2 sections are equally important. The scope and limitations tells readers exactly what your study covers, and equally important, what it does not cover. Every study has boundaries, and clearly defining them prevents readers from expecting answers your research was never intended to provide. The definition of terms, then, clarifies the meaning, operational meaning of important concepts as they are used in the study. You can think of chapter 1 as laying the foundation of a building. If the foundation is weak, every chapter that follows will also be weak. Thus, a poorly written background leads to an unclear problem statement. An unclear problem statement leads to weak objectives. Weak objectives results in inappropriate methods and confusing findings. Therefore, investing time in writing a strong chapter 1 makes the remainder of the thesis significantly easier. Let's dissect these section by section. The background of the study introduces readers to the research problem. Its purpose is not simply to provide information. Persuade readers that the problem is in fact important, real, and worthy of investigation. By the time readers finish this section, they should understand not only what the problem is, but also why solving it matters. A useful principle mentioned is writing from macro to micro. This means beginning with a broader context before narrowing your discussion to the specific issues your study will address. For example, if your research concerns the Philippine Coast Guard's technical diving capability, discuss security at national or international level. You would then narrow the discussion to underwater operations, then to technical diving, and finally to the specific capability gap within the Philippine Coast Guard. This gradual narrowing helps readers understand how your specific study fits in a much larger context. The background should also include a review of the previous research. However, this is not yet the comprehensive literature review of Chapter 2. Instead, you briefly summarize major studies, identify important findings, and point out where previous research has been insufficient. This naturally leads to the identification of a research gap. Readers should begin to see why another study is not necessarily previous work by justifying the present study. You should briefly explain how your research addresses the identified gap and what contributions it hopes to make. Think of these final paragraph as a bridge connecting the background to the problem statement. After explaining the problem, the next logical step is to state exactly what questions your research intends to answer. The problem statement, as you all know, is often described as the heart of the research proposal because it translates a broad issue into specific research questions. Many beginning researchers confuse the background with the problem statement. The background explains the context of the issue. The statement specifies exactly what the study seeks to investigate. Is an excellent example in this slide of the difference between a vague and a specific problem. Asking what is the extent of the dispute in the South China Sea is too broad. Entire books could be written to answer the question. However, asking what is the effect of the AFP's acquisition of modern naval ships on the country's credible defense posture, here we are able to introduce identifiable variables and a specific relationship between them. This question is focused enough to be independent systematically. A well-written problem statement should always align with the objectives of the study. Every research question should eventually produce one or this creates what researchers can call logical alignment. Researchers related. The rest of the thesis will lose direction because every succeeding chapter depends on them. Before finalizing the problem statement, ask yourself 3 questions. First question, is the research questionable? Sorry, is the research researchable or is the question researchable? Second, can the necessary data realistically be collected? And third, will answering the question contribute something useful to scholarship or even to practice? If the answer to all is yes, then you likely have a strong research problem. If not, realign the question until the question becomes clear, focused, and even delineated. Formulating research questions. Formulating research questions. At the heart of every research study are the research questions. If the problem statement tells us what issue we are addressing, the research questions tells us exactly what information we need to gather in order to address that issue. Every chapter that follows, from the literature review to the methodology, findings, and conclusions, will revolve around these questions. That is why formulating them correctly is one of the most important tasks in research writing. Notice that the presentation distinguishes between qualitative and quantitative research questions. In qualitative research, the researcher seeks to understand experiences, meanings, processes, or perspectives. Therefore, the questions are exploratory in nature. They often begin with verbs such as describe, explore, understand, discover, or report. For example, instead of asking whether a program is effective, a qualitative researcher may ask, what are the experiences of the participants during the implementation of the program? This type of question encourages rich and detailed answers. Quantitative research is different because it focuses on measuring variables and examining relationships among them. Here, research questions commonly ask whether variables are related, whether groups differ, or to what extent a phenomenon exists. Verbs such as compare, relate, and describe are commonly used. For example, a quantitative researcher might ask, is there a significant relationship between leadership style and employee performance? Such questions are designed to be answered through statistical analysis. We're also reminded that the research questions may be presented either as a narrative or as a numbered list. Regardless of the format, every question should be directly connected to the purpose of the study. Moreover, researchers should explain why these questions deserve investigation. Why is the issue important? Why is the organization concerned? Why should society care about the answers? Good research questions are not only methodologically sound, they are also meaningful. Goals and objectives. Once the research questions have been established, the next task is to define the goals and objectives of the study. While the research questions identify what we want to know, the objectives explain what we intend to accomplish through the research. In other words, the objectives translate curiosity into concrete research actions. The slide cites Creswell, who recommends beginning the purpose statement with a clear expression such as the purpose or the intent or the objective of this study is or was. This opening immediately informs readers about the central intention of the research. Whether your study seeks to understand, examine, develop, explore, or discover something, the purpose statement should communicate that intention directly and concisely. Avoiding vague language that leaves readers guessing about the study's direction is also very important. Specific objectives should always flow logically in a one-to-one correlation with the problem statement. That's why we always say every objective should correspond to one or more research questions. For example, if the first research question asks about the level of operational readiness of an organization, your first objective should state that the study aims to determine or assess that level of readiness. These one-to-one correspondence creates coherence throughout the thesis. So when objectives and research questions do not match, Readers become confused about what the study is actually trying to achieve. Another important point is that objectives should be specific, measurable, and achievable. They should identify who or what is being studied, indicate the expected outcomes, and remain realistic within the available time and resources. As Libero reminds us, objectives should avoid broad generalizations and should be arranged according to their importance. A well-written set of objectives becomes the roadmap that guides the entire research process. Significance of the study. After explaining what the study intends to accomplish, the researcher must explain why the study matters. This is the purpose of the significance of the study. Many beginning researchers simply claim that their study is important, but significance must not only be said, it must be demonstrated, not merely asserted. Readers should understand who benefits from the study and how those benefits contribute to knowledge or practice. We see several possible beneficiaries. First is the agency or the organization directly involved in the research. Your findings may help improve policies, operations, planning, training, or decision making. If your research concerns a government office, for example, the significance should explain how the results may improve organizational effectiveness or public service delivery. The study may also benefit the community or the country. Graduate research should not remain confined to academic discussions. Ideally, it contributes to solving real social, economic, political, or developmental problems. So, whether the study informs public policy, strengthens governance, enhances education, or improves healthcare, the researcher should clearly articulate these broader implications. Finally, the significance extends to future researchers and the academic community. Every thesis becomes part of the growing body of scholarly literature. Your work may identify new variables, propose improved methodologies, or reveal unanswered questions that inspire future investigations. In this sense, research is always part of an ongoing scholarly conversation, and we build upon the work of previous researchers while creating opportunities for those who come after us. Scope and delimitations. No research can answer every possible question. Every study has boundaries, and acknowledging those boundaries is both honest and scientifically necessary. This is the purpose of the recommendations. That's exactly what the study includes and what it deliberately excludes. The scope defines the coverage of the study, and it specifies the location, respondents, time frame, variables, and context being investigated. For example, a study may focus only on one government agency, one province, or one group of participants. By clearly defining the scope, the researcher prevents readers from expecting conclusions that extend beyond the intended coverage of the research. The limitations, on the other hand, acknowledge factors beyond the researcher's control. The presentation identifies several examples: intrinsic reliability, which refers to the consistency of the research instruments and collected data; extrinsic validity, which concerns whether the findings can reasonably be generalized beyond the sample studied; and other limitations that may include restricted access to documents, incomplete data, limited funding, or time constraints. These limitations do not necessarily weaken the study. Rather, they help readers interpret the findings appropriately. One common misconception is that researchers should hide the weaknesses of their study. In reality, the opposite is true. Transparent researchers openly acknowledge limitations because doing so demonstrates intellectual honesty. Every study has constraints. Recognizing them increases the credibility of the research and provides direction for future studies that may address those limitations. The final section, of course, of chapter 1 is the definition of terms. This section ensures that readers understand exactly how important concepts are that are used within the study. Words often carry multiple meanings, and researchers must remove ambiguity by clearly defining key terms before proceeding with the rest of the thesis. The presentation distinguishes between conceptual definition and operational definition. A conceptual definition comes from scholarly literature. It explains how experts or published authors understand a particular concept. For example, if your study investigates organizational commitment, the conceptual definition would be based on established theories and peer-reviewed publications. These definitions provide the theoretical foundation for the study. An operational definition is different because it explains how a concept is used within your specific research. Rather than providing a dictionary meaning, it tells readers how the concept is measured, observed, or interpreted in the study. Suppose your research examines operational readiness. Operationally, you may define it using indicators such as training, equipment, availability, and response capability. In this way, the operational definition directly connects the concept to your research objectives and methodology. Finally, we are also reminded that the definitions should be arranged alphabetically for easy reference. So, if the study contains a large number of specialized terms, they may be transferred to a glossary placed in the appendices. Meanwhile, abbreviations belong in the preliminary pages rather than in the definition of terms section. A carefully prepared definition of terms ensures that both the researcher and the reader speak the same language throughout the study, reducing confusion and improving the clarity of the entire thesis. Let's not wait longer and go to chapter 2. We now begin with chapter 2, the review of related literature, which many researchers consider one of the most intellectually demanding chapters of the thesis. Unlike chapter 1, where you explain your own research problem, chapter 2 requires every conversation with other scholars. It asks a simple but important question. What is already known about this topic? Notice that the chapter is divided into three major parts. The first is the review of related literature, where you examine previous studies, theories, and scholarly discussions related to your topic. The second is the synthesis and gaps, where you compare those studies and identify what remains unknown. Finally, you present the conceptual framework, which illustrates how the concepts in your own study are connected. These three sections build upon one another. If the literature review is weak, then the synthesis becomes superficial, and the conceptual framework loses its foundation. One common misconception is that chapter 2 is simply a collection of summaries. Students often read 20 articles and then write 20 summaries one after another. That approach is inappropriate or incorrect. The literature review is not a book report. It is a scholarly argument. You are not merely showing that you have read the literature. You are demonstrating that you understand it, can compare different perspectives, identify patterns, evaluate strengths and weaknesses, and eventually position your own research within that conversation. Think of chapter 2 as entering a room where many experts are already discussing your topic. Before speaking, you must first listen. You must understand what each caller is saying, where they agree, where they disagree, and what questions remain unanswered. Only after listening carefully can you confidently explain why your own study deserves a place in the conversation. Let's look at these sections one by one. The review of related literature is the first section and is often abbreviated as the RRL. This is the foundation upon which your study is built. Every research project begins when you understand and discover. This prevents duplication of effort and ensures that your study contributes something new rather than repeating what is already known. So we're reminded that the literature review is a synthesis of sorts, not an enumeration. This distinction is extremely important. An enumeration simply lists studies one after another. Author A found this, author B found that, author C studied another topic. While technically correct, such writing does not demonstrate critical thinking. A synthesis, on the other hand, compares studies, groups similar findings together, explains disagreements, and identifies patterns across the literature. It transforms many individual studies into one coherent discussion. Another important principle concerns organization. The presentation specifically advises against organizing the literature review according to local versus foreign studies, or according to the type of literature, book, journals, and the like. Instead, you are to organize the literature thematically. Suppose your study examines organizational readiness. Rather than separating Philippine studies from international studies, you might organize the review into themes such as leadership, training, resource management, operational capability, and organizational culture. This thematic approach helps readers understand the concepts rather than the geographic origin of the sources. Finally, notice the recommendation to cite at least 20 references, including at least 5 books. More important than the number is the quality of the sources. Use peer-reviewed journal articles, authoritative books, government publications, and reputable academic databases. Remember that your literature review demonstrates not only how much you have read, but also your, your ability to identify credible evidence and integrate it into a scholarly fashion. So what makes a good literature, or what does a good literature do? I think that's a very interesting question to confront at this point, right? Now that we know what a literature review is, let's ask a more important question. What makes a literature review good? The answer is that a good literature review does much more than summarize previous studies. It actively supports the development of your own research. The first function is to link your study to previous research. No research exists in isolation. Every thesis should explain how it relates to the larger body of scholarly work. Perhaps your study extends previous findings to a new setting. Perhaps it examines a different population. Perhaps it uses a new methodology. Whatever the contribution, readers should clearly understand how your work connects to existing knowledge. A second function is to compare and contrast previous studies. Researchers rarely agree on everything. Some studies report positive relationships while others report weak or contradictory findings. A good literature review explains these differences instead of ignoring them. Ask questions such as, why did researchers reach different conclusions? Or were they studying different populations? Did they use different methods? Were they operating under different theoretical assumptions? Critical comparison demonstrates scholarly maturity. Finally, the literature review provides the foundation for your conceptual framework. Every variable, concept, or relationship included in your framework should be supported by evidence from the literature. In other words, the conceptual framework does not appear out of nowhere. It grows naturally from the review of related literature. So when chapter 2 is written well, readers can easily see why the conceptual framework takes the form that it does. structuring the literature review. One of the most common questions students ask is, how should I organize my literature review? The answer depends on the type of research you are conducting. We need to distinguish quantitative from qualitative research because each requires a different organizational approach. For quantitative research, the structure is usually systematic. Researchers often begin by discussing the dependent variable because this is the primary outcome being investigated. Then they review literature on the independent variable that may influence it. After discussing these variables, they explain the broader context in which the study takes place, present the theory supporting the relationships among variables, and finally discuss any control variables moderating or intervening that may affect the results. This structure logically leads readers from theory to hypotheses. Qualitative research, however, offers greater flexibility. Since qualitative inquiry seeks to understand experiences, meanings, and processes, there is no universally prescribed structure. Instead, researchers organize the literature according to concepts that best illuminate the phenomenon being studied. Literature may introduce historical developments, theoretical perspectives, cultural contexts, or previous qualitative findings that help frame the inquiry. The emphasis is not on testing variables, but on understanding the phenomenon more deeply. Regardless of the approach, remember one important principle. The literature review should support your study, not replace it. Some students write literature reviews so extensive that readers lose sight of the research itself. Remember, every article, every book, every theory you discuss should contribute directly to understanding your research problem. If a source does not help explain your study, it probably does not belong in the review. That's why I suggested before, just follow the outline of the statement of the problem. Syntheses and gaps. Among all the sections of chapter 2, the synthesis gap and gaps is perhaps the most important. In fact, the slide explicitly described it as the most important subsection of the literature review, of course. Why? Because this is where you demonstrate original scholarly thinking. Up to this point, you have mainly discussed what other researchers have done. Now you must explain what they have not done. The first task is to synthesize the literature meaningfully. This means identifying patterns across studies rather than discussing each study individually. Ask questions such as, what findings appear consistently across the literature? Where do researchers disagree? What methodological weaknesses appear repeatedly? Which populations have been neglected? Which theoretical perspectives dominate the field? These observations allow you to see the larger picture instead of isolated pieces of evidence. Once these patterns become clear, you can identify the research gap. A research gap is not simply an area that no one has studied. It may involve conflicting findings, outdated evidence, overlooked populations, methodological limitations, or unanswered theoretical questions. The gap explains why another study is still necessary. Without a clearly identified gap, readers may reasonably ask, why conduct this research if previous studies have already answered the question? Finally, as if we're done, uh, it's also very important that the chapter concludes by summarizing what is already known and what remains unknown. This naturally leads to your own study. In other words, the synthesis and gap section serves as the bridge between previous scholarship and your research. When written effectively, readers should finish chapter 2 convinced that your study is not merely interesting, it is necessary. They should see exactly where your research enters the scholarly conversation and how it contributes to advancing knowledge. Let's go to the conceptual framework. We now arrive at one of the most important products of chapter 2, the conceptual framework. Many graduate students mistakenly think that the conceptual framework is simply a diagram placed between the literature review and the methodology. In reality, it is much more than a picture. It is a visual representation of your understanding of the research problem. It summarizes the relationships among the major concepts that your study intends to investigate. The conceptual framework connects every major component of the research. It links the research problem, the objectives, the literature review, the methodology, and even the data analysis. In other words, it serves as the blueprint of the study. If someone understands your conceptual framework, they should immediately understand how your research is organized and why each variable or concept has been included. It's also important to distinguish the conceptual framework from the theoretical framework because students frequently confuse these two. The theoretical framework comes from existing theory. It explains the established ideas or principles that provide the foundation for your research. For example, if your study is based on systems theory, institutional theory, or diffusion of innovation theory, this belongs to the theoretical framework. The conceptual framework, however, is your own construction. It takes ideas from theory and literature and organizes them specifically for your own study. In other words, the theoretical framework tells us why the concepts should be related, while the conceptual framework shows how they are related within your particular research. So when preparing your conceptual framework, remember that every arrow, every box, or every connection should have support from the literature. Do not include variables simply because they seem interesting. Every relationship should be justified by previous research or theory. Likewise, avoiding creating diagrams that are unnecessarily complicated. A conceptual framework should simplify your study, not confuse your readers. Its purpose is to communicate your research design clearly and logically before the methodology begins. Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is composed of 8 parts, but later on we will separate 3.8 as we have a different session for this one. But let's look at chapter 3 first. Having established the research problem, reviewed the literature, and developed the conceptual framework, we now enter chapter 3, methodology. If chapter 1 answers the question, what problem are we studying? And chapter 2 asks what is already known, then chapter 3 answers how will we conduct the study. Notice the 8 major sections presented in the chapter. It begins with the research design, where you explain the overall approach of the study, followed by the local unit of the study and sampling design, all of which describes where the research takes place and who or what will be studied. And these sections ensures that readers understand the context in which the data were gathered. The chapter then proceeds to the operational aspects of the research. Data collection procedure, which explains how information was gathered. Research instruments that describe the tools used to collect data. Data analysis, which explains how the collected information was interpreted. And finally, the chapter concludes with the action plan and project matrix, which presents the implementation plan of the proposed research project or intervention. Think of chapter 3 as the instruction manual for your research. If another researcher wishes to replicate your study, this chapter should provide enough detail for them to follow the same procedures. That is why methodology must always be written clearly, systematically, and transparently. Good methodology does not merely describe what was done, it justifies why those procedures were appropriate for answering the research questions. I know I've been talking for almost an hour, but 8 sections very quickly. Let's go through them. Let's go. Research methodology and design. The first section of chapter 3 discusses research methodology and research design. Although these terms are often used interchangeably, they refer to different concepts. Understanding this distinction is essential because it affects the entire direction of the study. The research methodology refers to the overall philosophical approach or paradigm of the study. It answers the question, what general approach best fits the nature of the research problem? The presentation identifies 3 major methodological traditions: qualitative design, quantitative, and the combination of both, mixed method. Each has its own assumptions, strengths, and limitations. Qualitative research seeks to understand meaning and experiences. Quantitative research measures variables and tests relationships. Mixed methods combines both approaches to gain a more comprehensive understanding of the phenomenon. The research design, on the other hand, is the specific strategy used within that methodology. For example, for qualitative research, examples include case study, grounded theory, phenomenology, ethnography. And each research design addresses different kinds of questions. A phenomenological study explores lived experiences, while a case study investigates a bounded system such as an organization or program. Quantitative research also has several designs, including experimental, descriptive, causal comparative, correlational, or survey research, each chosen according to the objectives of the study. Selecting the appropriate methodology and design is one of the most important decisions a researcher makes. The choice should never be based on convenience or personal preference. Instead, it should always be guided by the research questions. A mismatch between the research questions and the methodology can weaken the credibility of the entire study. Therefore, researchers must first understand what they are trying to discover before deciding how they will investigate it. In writing the research design section, we need to know that knowing your research design is only the first step. The next challenge is explaining it clearly in the thesis. We need to provide guidance on how to write the research design section so that readers understand both your methodological choices and the reasons behind them. For qualitative research, the discussion should begin by explaining why a qualitative approach is appropriate for the problem. You should then identify the specific design, such as phenomenology, case study, or grounded theory, and justify why it best addresses the research questions. An important feature of qualitative research is the role of the researcher. Since the researcher serves as a primary research instrument, it is necessary to acknowledge potential biases and explain how objectivity and trustworthiness will be maintained throughout the study. For quantitative research, the emphasis shifts towards variables and measurements. Researchers must explain how the independent, dependent, moderating, intervening, mediating variables are operationalized. Readers should understand exactly how each variables will be measured and why those measurements are appropriate. Supporting these methodological choices with established methodological literature strengthens the credibility of the research design. Finally, the presentation reminds us about the correct use of the verb tense. During the proposal stage, methodology is written in the future tense because the research has not yet been conducted. Statements such as the researcher will conduct interviews or data will be analyzed are therefore appropriate. Once the study has been completed, these statements must be revised into the past tense. This small grammatical adjustment reflects an important reality. The methodology chapter in the final thesis documents what actually happened rather than what was planned. Let's go to 3.2, the locale of the study. The locale of the study, at first glance, no? The locale of the study is straightforward because it simply identifies where the research was conducted. However, a well-written locale section does much more than provide an address or a geographic location. The researcher should first explain why the particular location was selected. Every research site should have logical connection to the research objectives. For example, if a study examines disaster response capability, the selected organization or community should possess characteristics that make it appropriate for investigating that issue. Readers should understand why the chosen site is relevant and why another location would not have served the same purpose. The local section should also describe important characteristics of the setting. Depending on the nature of the study, these characteristics may include geographic location, organizational structure, population, economic conditions, operating functions, historical background. However, avoid including unnecessary details. Every piece of information should help readers better understand the context in which the research was conducted. Finally, we also recommend using maps and other visual representations whenever appropriate. A properly labeled map allows readers to immediately visualize the location of the study and understand its relevance to the research. More importantly, the locale section reminds that research never takes place in isolation. Every study occurs within a specific environment, and understanding that environment helps readers correctly interpret the findings. Context gives meaning to data, and the locale of the study provides that context. Next, unit of the study. One of the first questions every researcher must answer is, who or what exactly is being studied? This is the purpose of the unit of the study section. While the locale tells us where the study takes place, the unit of the study tells us what the actual object of investigation is. Many beginning researchers confuse the unit of the study with the respondents, but they're not the same. The unit of analysis may be an individual, a group, an organization, a community, or even a document. For example, if you are studying leadership among school principals, the unit of analysis is the individual principal. If you are evaluating disaster preparedness in local government units, then the local government unit itself becomes the unit of analysis. Similarly, if your research investigates military doctrine, the documents may become the unit of analysis rather than people. So we are reminded that we also need to describe the characteristics of the population. For quantitative studies, this may include demographic informations such as age, sex, educational attainment, years of service, or organizational position. For qualitative studies, it is equally important to explain why the chosen participants possess the knowledge or experience necessary to answer the research questions. The emphasis is not on quantity, but on relevance. So, the unit of the study section should justify why these participants or organizations were selected. Readers should understand that the participants are not chosen randomly or merely because they are available. Rather, they are selected because they are the most appropriate sources of information for addressing the research problem. A clearly defined unit of analysis helps establish the validity and even the credibility of the entire study. Sampling design. After studying the unit of the study, the next question becomes, how do we choose the participants? This is the role of the sampling design section. Since it is Since it is often impossible to study an entire population, researchers select a smaller group or sample that can provide the necessary information. We need to distinguish between probability and non-probability sampling. Probability sampling is commonly used in quantitative research because every member of the population has a known chance of being selected. Examples include simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, cluster sampling. These methods help reduce sampling bias and improve the generalizability of the findings. Qualitative research, on the other hand, usually relies on non-probability sampling because the goal is not statistical representation, but rich, meaningful information. Methods such as purposive sampling, snowball sampling, quota sampling, convenience sampling are commonly used. In purposive sampling, for example, participants are intentionally selected because they possess specialized knowledge or experience directly related to the research problem. The researcher values expertise rather than representativeness. Regardless of the sampling method, researchers must justify their choices. If the study uses a statistical formula such as Lovin's formula to determine the sampling size, the computation should be explained. Slovin or Yamane, as we said. If qualitative participants are selected purposively, the inclusion and exclusion criteria should be described. Good sampling is not simply about selecting participants. It is about demonstrating that those participants are the appropriate sources of evidence for answering the research questions. Let's move to 3.5 and data collection procedures. Again, once the participants have been selected, the researchers must explain how the data were collected. This is the purpose of the data collection procedures. Readers should be able to follow every step of the research process, from obtaining permission to collecting the final set of data. The process usually begins by securing the necessary approvals from institutions, organizations, or ethics committees. Researchers must explain who granted permission, how participants were informed about the study, and how informed consent was obtained. Ethical considerations are inseparable from good research methodology. Participants should understand the purpose of the study, the voluntary nature of their participation, and the measure taken to protect confidentiality. The procedures differ also depending on the research methodology. In qualitative research, the discussion should describe how interviews, focus group discussions, observations, or document analyses were conducted. Explain who facilitated the interviews, how long they lasted, how conversations were recorded, and how documents were obtained. Mention any challenges encountered during data collection and how they were addressed. These demonstrates transparency and strengthens the trustworthiness of the study. In quantitative research, researchers describe how questionnaires were distributed, whether surveys were conducted online or face-to-face, and whether pilot testing or experiments were performed. The key principle is reproducibility. Reproducibility. Another researcher should be able to read your procedures and understand exactly how your data were gathered. The clearer your procedures, the more credible your methodology becomes. research instrument. This is where many of you failed to produce during your defenses. But the research instrument is part of the proposal, which means when you submit your proposal, it should be there in the appendices. The research instrument is the tool used to gather information from participants or other data sources. It serves as the bridge between the research questions and the collected data. So if the instrument is poorly designed, even the best research questions cannot produce meaningful findings. Therefore, careful attention must be given to instrument development. The type of instrument depends on the research design. Again, in quantitative research, the instrument is often a structured questionnaire or survey containing carefully developed items that measure specific variables. In qualitative research, the instrument usually consists of interview guides, focus group discussion guides, observation protocols, or document analysis matrices. Regardless of the format, every question should contribute directly to answering one or more research questions. An important point emphasized by the presentation is pre-testing. Before using the instrument in the actual study for quantitative research, it should first be tested with individuals who possess characteristics similar to those of the intended participants. Retesting helps identify ambiguous wordings, confusing instructions, missing response options, or technical problems. Revising the instrument after pre-testing significantly improves its clarity and validity. Researchers should explain the logic behind the instrument's construction. Readers should understand how the questions were developed, which theories or literature support them, and how they relate to the conceptual framework. In addition, the complete instrument should be included in the appendices. Doing so allows readers and future researchers to examine the actual questions used during the study, thereby enhancing transparency and scholarly integrity. Data analysis. In a normal thesis, this is the final methodological component of the paper, but the one that will demand careful analysis. Collecting data is only the beginning of the research process. The real value of research lies in transforming raw information into meaningful conclusions. Data analysis provides the procedures through which that transformation occurs. And we do this per statement of the problem. For quantitative research, analysis usually begins by organizing the data into tables and graphs, and researchers then compute descriptive stats such as frequencies, percentages, means, standard deviations. Depending on the objectives of the study, inferential statistical techniques may also be used to test relationships or differences among variables. The presentation reminds us that we need to establish the reliability and validity of measurement instruments using procedures such as Cronbach alpha, as well as assessments of convergent and discriminant validity when appropriate. For qualitative research, data analysis follows a different process. Instead of calculating statistics, researchers identify recurring ideas, patterns, and meanings within the collected data. This often involves coding interview transcripts, grouping similar codes into categories, and eventually developing broader themes. Common approaches include content analysis or thematic analysis. Throughout this process, researchers should explain how themes were generated and how interpretations remain faithful to the particular experiences. So, but we need to also emphasize trustworthiness. Whether conducting qualitative or quantitative research, we must be confident that the findings accurately represent reality. Qualitative research establishes credibility through techniques of triangulation, member checks, or peer review, and maintaining an audit trail. Quantitative research establishes rigor through reliability and validity testing. Although the methods differ, the goal remains the same: to produce findings that are accurate, dependable, and worthy of informing knowledge, policy, and practice. 3.8 is about the action plan and project matrix. I'll just describe it briefly now, but we will see this more closely in the second section, in the synchronous lecture. So the final section is the action plan and project, and this is unique only to students of DAP. Many students mistakenly think that this section is simply a timetable of activities. In reality, it is much more than a schedule. It demonstrates that the researcher has carefully planned how the research plus the intervention or project will be implemented. Notice the different elements that are included in the matrix. It identifies the objectives of the research, but also of the intervention, the major activities, the expected results, the persons responsible, the time frame, the possible risks, the risk treatment or mitigation strategy, and even the budget. Each component answers a practical question: what needs to be accomplished? Who will do it? When will it happen? What challenges might arise? How will those challenges be addressed? By addressing these questions, the action plan transforms research findings into a practical implementation strategy. An important point to mention is that the action plan should reflect the actual study process. During the proposal stage, researchers prepare an initial project plan. However, after completing the research, that plan may change because of new discoveries, unforeseen delays, improved understanding of the problem. The revised action plan should therefore describe what was actually learned during the research process and how those lessons affect implementation. Ultimately, this reminds us that graduate research is not purely academic. A thesis should contribute to organizational improvement, policy development, or professional practice. In public administration specifically, research is expected to solve real problems rather than simply produce academic knowledge. The action plan for DAP students demonstrates that the researcher has considered how the findings can be translated into concrete and sustainable action. Let's stop share. So, writing a master's thesis is a systematic process of producing scholarly knowledge through rigorous research. The thesis follows a standard procedure composed of three major parts: the preliminaries, the five main chapters, of which we've only done chapters 1 to 3, and the back sheets. Each component has a distinct purpose, and together they communicate the research in a logical, transparent, and academically acceptable manner. The preliminaries establish the identity and credibility of the manuscript. They include the title page, disclaimer, endorsement, acknowledgement, abstract, table of contents, list of tables, list of figures, list of appendices, and list of acronyms. Although these sections contain little substantive discussion of the research itself, they provide readers with information necessary to understand the organization, authorship, and official status of the thesis. The title should be concise and descriptive, while the abstract serves as a standalone summary of the objectives, methodology, findings, conclusions of the completed study. Chapter 1, The Problem and its Context, establishes the foundation of the research. It begins with the background of the study, where the researcher presents the problem from a broad context to a specific issue to be investigated. The problem statement translates this issue into focused research questions that are both researchable and aligned with the study's objectives. These objectives explain what the research intends to accomplish and must correspond directly to the research question. The chapter also explains the significance of the study, identifying the beneficiaries and the contributions of the research, followed by the scope and limitations, which define the study's boundaries and acknowledge its constraints. Finally, the definition of terms clarifies how important concepts are used within the study through conceptual and operational definitions. Chapter 2, Review of Related Literature, situates the study within existing scholarship. Rather than merely summarizing previous studies, the literature review synthesizes findings, compares differing perspectives, and identifies recurring patterns and disagreements. The literature should be organized thematically instead of by geographical origin or document type. A good literature review demonstrates how the proposed study relates to previous work while simultaneously revealing gaps in current knowledge. These gaps justify the need for the present investigation. The chapter culminates in the conceptual framework, which visually illustrates the relationship among the concepts and variables included in the study. Supported by the theoretical framework and previous literature, the conceptual framework serves as the blueprint connecting the research problem, objectives, methodology, and analysis. Chapter 3, Methodology, explains how the research is conducted. It begins by identifying the overall research methodology, qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, and the specific research design appropriate for answering the research questions. The chapter then describes the locale of the study, justifying why the research site was selected and explaining its relevant characteristics. It identifies the unit of the study, specifying whether the research focuses on individuals, organizations, groups, or documents, and explains the rationale for selecting them. The methodology further discusses the sampling design, distinguishing between probability sampling, commonly used in quantitative research, and non-probability sampling, frequently employed in qualitative inquiry. Researchers must justify both the sampling method and sample size of the participant selection criteria. The data collection procedure provides a step-by-step account of how data were gathered, including ethical considerations, permissions obtained, and the conduct of interviews, surveys, and observations of document analysis. The chapter also explains the research instrument, describing the tools used to gather data, the rationale behind their construction, and the procedures followed to ensure their validity through pre-testing. The discussion concludes with data analysis, where quantitative studies employ descriptive and inferential statistics, while qualitative studies use coding, categorization, thematic analysis, or content analysis. Regardless of methodology, researchers must demonstrate the trustworthiness, validity, reliability, and credibility of their writings. Finally, the methodology and this summary concludes with the action plan and project matrix, which translates the research into practical implementation strategies. Yes, the research, not just your findings. And this matrix identifies objectives, activities, expected outputs, responsible individuals, timelines, risks, mitigation strategies, and resource requirements, budget. It demonstrates that the research is not merely an academic exercise, but a practical contribution capable of improving organizations, informing policy, and addressing real-world problems. So, having said what needs to be said, I think this is enough for the review. I'll see you face to face in a while. Thank you very much for listening.